When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the Western world made a confident prediction that within months, perhaps even weeks, the Russian economy would collapse under the weight of unprecedented sanctions. The ruble would fall, factories would close, ordinary citizens would turn against the war, and the Kremlin would be forced to retreat, not by military defeat, but by economic exhaustion. That was the story we were told. But as the months turned into years, something entirely different happened. Russia's GDP recovered, inflation stabilized, energy exports found new buyers, and today, by many measures, Russia's economy has not only survived, it has grown faster than those of the United Kingdom, Germany, and Japan. So what went wrong with the prediction? Was the West too optimistic about the power of sanctions, or too naive about the resilience of the Russian system? Perhaps both. Because what the world failed to see is that Russia has quietly transformed itself into something else entirely, a war economy. An economy that no longer follows the rules of peace and prosperity, but those of survival and control. An economy that measures success not in comfort, but in endurance. This is not the story of collapse. It is the story of adaptation and the dangerous stability of a nation built for war. When the first wave of sanctions hit, Western economists pulled out their models. They compared Russia's isolation to Iran, to Venezuela, even to the Soviet collapse of 1991. And every graph, every equation pointed to the same outcome: economic breakdown. But the reality refused to cooperate. Let's take a step back and look at why Russia's war economy has shocked so many analysts. After all, since the war began, Russia's economy has actually outperformed major European powers like the UK and even Germany. So, why did most analysts get it so wrong? The main reason, I think, is this: they were trained to understand peacetime economies, not wartime economies. And to really grasp why Russia has managed to beat expectations like this, let's take a quick lesson. War Economics 101. Let's start with a simple definition. What is a war economy? In a normal economy, growth is measured by prosperity, by how much people can buy, how freely they can travel, how high their living standards climb. But in a war economy, the question changes entirely. It no longer asks, what's good for the people? It asks, what's necessary to win? And when that shift happens, almost everything that once signaled decline, shortages, central control, rationing, suddenly becomes a feature, not a flaw. History has seen this pattern before. In the late 1930s, Nazi Germany pulled itself out of depression through rearmament. Unemployment vanished, production soared, GDP skyrocketed. But that growth was an illusion. It was built on steel, oil, and gunpowder. The same happened in the United States during the 1940s. Factories that once built cars began building bombers. The economy exploded, not because people were richer, but because the nation had mobilized every resource for war. That's the brutal paradox of a war economy. It can look healthy on paper, even while it eats itself alive. Russia is following that very trajectory today. By pouring billions into weapons production, conscripting workers, and centralizing power, it has turned crisis into momentum. The numbers look strong, but they're being fueled by sacrifice, not stability. And what we're seeing is not revival, it's mobilization. Once the logic of war takes over, the state begins searching for every idle piece of capacity, every silent factory, every pair of hands not yet working. That's exactly what happened in Russia. As Western companies pulled out, millions of jobs and assets were left behind. The Kremlin didn't mourn them, it absorbed them. Factories that once produced cars now produce armored vehicles. Civilian engineers now build drones. The government pumped billions of rubles into defense contracts, and suddenly, unemployment dropped to its lowest level in history. In peacetime, that kind of state intervention would be called inefficient. In wartime, it's called necessary. The same pattern has played out before. In the 1930s, the United States pulled itself out of the Great Depression through massive public spending, first on infrastructure, then on arms. Germany did it too, turning idle labor into soldiers and industry into armament. When a nation reactivates what was once dormant, when the rusted factories roar back to life, when the unemployed are called back to the assembly line, GDP growth is not a miracle. It's a mechanism, a predictable outcome of war mobilization, not a sign of prosperity. And Russia has mastered this first phase. But the real challenge lies in what comes next, not building more, but controlling more. If the first phase of Russia's war economy was about production, the second was about protection, building what economists now call Fortress Russia. When sanctions froze over $300 billion of Russian assets abroad, many believed it would be the breaking point. For any other nation, it might have been. But Russia responded with something the West didn't expect: control. It sealed its financial borders. Foreign investors could no longer freely move their money. Companies were forced to convert earnings into rubles. The central bank raised interest rates overnight, choking capital flight before it began. To understand why that worked, we need to look at one of the most basic dilemmas in economics: the monetary trilemma. It says no country can have all three of these things at once: free capital flows, an independent monetary policy, and a fixed exchange rate. You can only pick two. Most open economies, like those in Europe or the US, choose freedom of capital and independent policy, accepting that their currencies will rise and fall. Russia chose differently. It sacrificed openness in exchange for stability. By locking down capital movement and controlling the exchange rate, it created a kind of financial bunker, a fortress economy insulated from external shocks. When the ruble began to crash in early 2022, Moscow didn't rely on market confidence, it banned the panic. Capital controls kept money from leaving, state intervention propped up the currency, and within weeks the ruble, once written off as worthless, rebounded stronger than before. It was a brutal, authoritarian fix, but it worked. And that's the uncomfortable truth. What Western democracies couldn't do, impose total control over markets and money, Russia could. And that power to suspend economic freedom is precisely what has kept its system standing. Every economy that collapses follows a familiar path. Different circumstances, different histories, but always the same anatomy of failure. There are, broadly speaking, 4 roads that lead to collapse, and Russia, one by one, has blocked them all. The first road, capital flight. When a crisis hits, investors rush for the exit, money flees, currencies sink, and the system unravels. Russia saw it coming and sealed the gates. With capital controls, frozen foreign accounts, and strict currency conversion rules, the Kremlin made sure that panic couldn't escape. You can't have a bank run if the doors are locked. The second road, loss of critical imports. Sanctions were meant to starve Russia of the materials it needed: semiconductors, machinery, precision parts. And for a time they did. But Moscow found detours. China filled the gap in electronics and vehicles. India expanded oil trade. Turkey and the Gulf states became silent intermediaries. Trade didn't stop. It just changed its routes. The third road, unsustainable debt. This is how most crises begin. Too much borrowing, not enough trust. But Russia entered this war with one of the lowest debt-to-GDP ratios in the world. Years of conservative fiscal policy, ironically, gave it room to maneuver. While Western nations printed money to stimulate growth, Russia hoarded its earnings. When the shock came, it had reserves, not liabilities. And the fourth road, social collapse. Because in the end, no economy falls purely from numbers. It falls when people give up, when they no longer believe that endurance has a purpose. But inside Russia, that moment hasn't arrived, at least not yet. State propaganda keeps the war framed as survival. Dissent is crushed before it can gather force, and as long as the collective will holds, so does the system. So if an economy can die through capital flight, lost imports, unpayable debt, or social breakdown, Russia has closed off every route, not because it is stronger, but because it plays by different rules. Rules that value control over comfort, endurance over efficiency, and silence over freedom. That's why the collapse so many expected never came. Because you can't break a system that's built to absorb pain. For all the talk of collapse, one truth remains. Russia is not exhausted. If you look at military spending as a share of GDP, Russia today still spends less than the United States did during the Vietnam War, and less than the Soviet Union did in the 1980s. They have not yet reached their limit. They are still below it. Phase 1 was about survival, mobilize resources, stabilize the currency, redirect the economy toward war. And they did it ruthlessly, efficiently, quietly. Now begins Phase 2, the phase that truly defines a war economy, not about soldiers, but about citizens, not about guns, but about obedience. Prices will soon be fixed, private industries will be told what to produce, and for whom. Imports will be rationed, luxury will fade from the shelves, and ordinary Russians will be asked, or forced, to sacrifice their comfort, their consumption, even their freedom, for the sake of a national mission. In Moscow's logic, this isn't a crisis, it's purification. This is what a real war economy looks like, an entire society reorganized for endurance, not prosperity. A machine that feeds on control, fueled by the belief that hardship is proof of loyalty. Western observers call it stagnation, but for the Kremlin, it's transformation, a shift from survival to permanence, from emergency to identity. Because to them, this is no longer about Ukraine. It's about building a state that cannot be cornered again, a fortress that can withstand isolation, sanctions, and even truth itself. Russia hasn't ended. They've only just begun. So, here's the hard truth. Don't wait for Russia to collapse. The narratives of imminent ruin are comforting, but they are wrong. Russia has fortified itself, economically, financially, and socially. It has blocked every road to collapse that history tells us should have ended it. War isn't fought only on battlefields. It's fought inside factories, in bank accounts, in the choices citizens make every day. And if the West continues to assume that Russia will break under pressure, it may be the West that miscalculates. Russia is not exhausted. They've only just begun. The question is clear. Will the world act in time, or will it watch another war economy roll on, gaining strength while the clock ticks? Economics, at its core, is a story about willpower. It's about how much a society is willing to endure, how much it can adapt, and how it chooses to survive under pressure. Sometimes, the nation that can bear the greatest strain, that can sacrifice comfort, freedom, and short-term prosperity, is the nation that endures the longest. History reminds us, strength is not always measured in wealth or abundance, it is measured in resilience. And that, in the end, is the lesson we can draw from Russia, from every economy at war, and from every society facing the pressure of history.